In the story of the French Revolution, the name Friedrich Gentz is associated with the Austrian foreign minister Clemens von Metternich and the German translation of Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. Gentz is important because, despite his position as a diplomat, civil servant, and a publicist, he was predominantly a thinker. He thought about the revolution philosophically and pragmatically for reasons beyond forwarding his personal ideals and political ambitions, and further, he publicized his thoughts. Gentz, therefore, is one of the earliest German examples, following the French Revolution, of a type of political journalist who subjectively interpreted rather than objectively reported on events. Gentz's exposure to rationalistic Enlightenment climate of Berlin informed much of his early opinions of the French Revolution and would continue to influence his later-day conservatism. Born in Breslau, Prussian Silesia in 1764, the Gentz family moved to Berlin in 1779. Berlin, the capital of Prussia and the place of Gentz's childhood, was under the Hohenzollern rule in 18th century. Central Europe in the 18th century comprised of many small states. The Habsburgs, as well as Hohenzollern dynasties, vied for the control of these states to increase their sphere of influence in Central Europe. Up till Gentz's 20th year, Prussia was ruled by Frederick the Great. Frederick II's rule began with considerable enthusiasm, but by the 1780s, his ways had become too outdated to please anyone. This was because by the late 18th century, Frederick had become a Baroque king in the age of Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, or the Aufklärung as it was called in the German-speaking states, had become increasingly sophisticated because of the philosophers like Immanuel Kant and Christian Garve. These philosophers began to write about the relationships between ethics and the government. The rule and privilege of a few hundred aristocrats over thousands of people was brought under question, especially when it was obvious that individual ethics were suspended for the retention of the ruler's authority. As a result, Frederick, by the time of his death in 1786, did not strike much enthusiasm among his subjects. Gentz's intellectual development took place in the salons of Frederick's Berlin and amid prominent figures of the Aufklärung in universities. In the salons and social clubs of the time, Gentz mingled with people and ideas vibrant with the rationalism of the Enlightenment and the relaxed morals of the period. Friedrich's father, Johann Gentz, was well acquainted with philosophers such as Mendelssohn and Kant. Therefore, when Gentz entered the University of Königsberg in 1783, he did so under the tutelage of Kant. Kant was already a well-known philosopher by this time. He published his masterpiece, Critique of Pure Reason, in 1781, 2 years before Gentz arrived at Königsberg. Gentz's university years were marked by frequent dining at Kant's house, and as expected, his own moral and mental pattern aligned with that of the philosopher. By 1789, Gentz was of the view that reason and liberty were the most important aspects of human nature. He believed that political systems within and diplomatic relations without the borders of the country should be based on these values. The ruler in such a political system was authorized by the people and consequently was answerable to the people. It is no surprise then that in 1791 he described the French Revolution as the first practical triumph of philosophy, the first example of a form of government which is founded on the principles and upon a consistent logical system. In early 1791, the French Revolution was still, for Gentz, the practical application of a brilliant idea. Gentz first encountered Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France in the spring of 1791. He read it with predictable hostility towards its contents. However, he admired Burke's mastery of style and his eloquence. That was the year in which he began to work on translating Burke's Reflections. By 1792, the French Revolution had embarked on a road of violence and terror that Gens, with his taste for peace and genteel social interactions, would have undoubtedly found alarming. His translation was published in 1792, and by this time he thought of the French Revolution as a political system hatch that was threatening the peace and security of all nations. Burke's translation that was published that year consolidated his position in Germany as an anti-revolutionary, and he would remain so for the rest of his life, at least in principle, if not always in situations that demanded diplomatic compromise. Despite his disillusionment and the subsequent active opposition to the French Revolution, Burke's reflections did not convert him overnight into an anti-revolutionary. When his political stance changed in 1791, Burke's arguments certainly drew admiration from him. But his admiration was never one of blind devotion or that of an indiscriminating student or follower who agreed with everything Burke said. Gens was first and foremost a Kantian, and he carried the Kantian vision of reason and liberty even in his last days. What caused Gens's skepticism towards the French Revolution was the terrorism it unleashed. He was against the excesses of pillaging, massacres, and vandalism, but he was not against the principles of the revolutions that the revolution claimed to embrace, that is, of reason and liberty. However, as the revolution progressed, it came to represent to him the very thing it was supposed to fight against, injustice and oppression. Gens's admiration for Burke thus stemmed from his agreement with him on certain fundamental points. He accepted Burke's stand on the importance of history and tradition and the futility of fixating on abstract concepts to construct a real political system. The folly of the French Revolution was, according to Gens, its lack of moderation, its vengeful frenzy, and the total absence of political common sense. In the tract, The Origin and Principles of the American Revolution, compared with the Origin and Principles of the French Revolution, which he published in 1800, he asserted this position. He argued that the French Revolution began as an offensive war, not as a defensive war. The offensiveness of the war showed no moderation, and as a result turned into a frenzied, uncontrollable, and violent situation when it should have been milder. By 1793, Gens was one of the most coherent voices against the French Revolution. Gens was one of the first people in Central Europe to recognize the power of the press in shaping public opinion and international politics. He regularly submitted political essays and articles to the press in Berlin. At this time, he extracted the potent qualities of British traditionalism, that of moderation, respect for established institutions and traditions, and pragmatism, and wielded from it a diplomatic tool that informed the balance of power politics in Central Europe for the rest of the 19th century. Furthermore, working alongside Metternich, he used his skills as a publicist to align the forces of conservatism to negotiate Austrian foreign diplomacy. Gens therefore emerges as a unique figure in Central European history. He brought to the public German sphere a kind of press that is reflective and interpretive, and that which combined the philosophy of Berlin Enlightenment with British conservatism.